Welcome to the Archaeology of the Roman Diet. I'm really excited about this. Food is kind of my geek, Roman food in particular, but all food because why not? It's fun and it's tasty. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is the traditional view of the art of the Roman diet and how modern archaeology is changing that for us. So a lot of us are familiar with this traditional view of the Roman diet. We get it from historians like Harold Johnson, who quoted in his paper on the lives of Romans, "Grain and grapes and olives furnished subsistence for all who did not live to eat. These gave the wine that maketh glad the heart of man, and oil to make his face to shine, and bread that strengthens man's heart. On these three abundant products of the soil, the mass of the people of Italy lived of old as they live today." So what is Harold Johnson talking about? He is talking about the Mediterranean triad: grapes, grains, and olives. And it's been an assumption for a really long time in history. Even Johnson wasn't basing his assumption on anything that hadn't existed pre his time. Some of the earlier historians, among them Joachim Marquardt and Ludwig Friedlander, paint this picture of the diet of the average Roman citizen as being one of mere subsistence. If you do a Google search now, even to this day, you will find articles quoting that the poorest Romans ate badly and even like animals, while the rich dined lavishly on the best and most exotic things. Many of these articles also claim that the vast majority of the Roman population are living in abject poverty. To contrast this, we have writings from the period, from the 1st century and onwards, that actually tell us what the elite authors of the period thought about Roman food. Among these are Cato's De Agricultura, Pliny's Naturalis Historia, and of course, the De Re Rustica by Columella. All of these writings tell us about viticulture, gardening, animal husbandry, beekeeping, even cheese making. Cato, Pliny, and Columella all agree that there are a vast array of different things that are being grown throughout the Roman Empire. They cover everything from what's being grown locally, because Pliny and Columella especially considered themselves gentlemen farmers, to things that were coming in from outside the empire, or outside the Central Empire. The region of Campania in which Pompeii and Herculaneum are located is famed for its fertility. Again, it's about the Mediterranean triad. The slopes of Mount Vesuvius create such a fertile landscape that grapes and grains and the olives grow there in very fertile soil. But what Pliny and Columella also tell us is that the region predominantly produced grapes and olives as export crops. Cato and Columella also tell us about cabbages and varieties of nuts that are being grown here, but you don't see them talking about a lot of grain. Well, clearly, if the Mediterranean triad is the foundation of the Roman diet, we would expect to see more grain grown in this region. But the archaeological record and even the written record from contemporary historians doesn't bear this out. Add to this picture, you have the writings of Apicius. I'm sure most of us know that Marcus Gavius Apicius is one of the famous Epicureans of the 1st century. And though his seminal work is considered the Bible for Roman cookery, it wasn't actually compiled until many centuries after his death. Of the some 500 recipes that are contained in his book, most of them are attributed to Apicius, but again, most of our evidence is apocryphal. It's on works like Pliny and Cato and Columella and Apicius that historians like Johnson based their belief in the Mediterranean triad. They were familiar with the region of the Bay of Naples, which is some of the most fertile areas in coastal Rome, again, because of the soil of Vesuvius. But poets like Horace, Martial, and Juvenal give us a little more middle class depiction. Some of the foods you see pictured here are described in the poets. One meal described by Marshall sounds very humble: lettuce and eggs and olives and smoked cheese and fish. While another poet, Macrobius, describes a meal that contains over 27 dishes. So these writings show us some difference between the elite diet. The poets would argue that their lifestyles are humble and they're eating less than the elites. But if you read the clues that they give you, you'll find that even the poets describe food that is much more flavorful and rich and varied than we would expect of a middle-class diet based on what historians tell us the lower middle-class citizens of Rome ate. In contrast for the humble diet, of course, we have our traditional image of the elites dining reclined while waited on and lavishly entertained. So what's the truth? Well, that's a really good question. We have a lot of information to unpack here because we have this elite upper class view from the first century elites. We have a more middle class view from the poets. And then we have what history tells us is that Romans, the average Roman lived to die early and in great suffering. So the excavations that are going on at Pompeii and Herculaneum give us a whole new insight. This region is particularly able to give us a snapshot because of the events that happened at Vesuvius. And if I'm going too fast or you have a question, please feel free to interrupt me. Sometimes I kind of get stuck into being excited about this topic and I forget to give people a chance to ask questions. And I apologize, I am having a really bad case of allergies today, so my voice is very scratchy. The key to the new evidence that we're getting has entirely to do with this region of Campania. This is the central region around Vesuvius, containing Naples, Herculaneum, Aplantis, Pompeii, and Stabiae. And of course, it's the events of 79 AD that give us our window into the past. In most cases, when we're looking at the past, we're looking at records of a dead community. Most of the time, written records, sometimes little bits of pot shards to tell us what happened. In the case of Herculaneum and Pompeii, what we have is a frozen moment. Because the events of Vesuvius happened so fast, we're able to get a snapshot into a living community that we previously haven't been able to. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the events of 79 AD. Our best record of this event comes from the account of Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, or Pliny the Younger as he's more commonly known. In his letters to the historian Tacitus, he describes the violent eruption of the mountain in great detail. His account of the event includes the ash and stone falling from the sky, the enormous cloud of volcanic debris that shot into the sky, and the choking, noxious fumes. He even recounts the efforts of his uncle Pliny the Elder to rescue the endangered citizens before he died in the attempt. What is clear from Pliny the Elder's account is the suddenness of the eruption and how utterly unprepared the residents of the region were for such a catastrophe. The people of Pompeii had no idea what to do when the sky turned black as night and the air filled with choking ash. Such a circumstance must have terrified them, evidenced by their flight from their homes. It is clear from the archaeological record that people abandoned much of their belongings, some probably with the idea that once the eruption was over, they'd be able to return for them. Some waited too long, waited till the last moment, and fled, carrying only what they needed to survive. Some, failing to make their escapes, hid wherever they could, in gladiatorial barracks, in the interiors of homes, or in the cellars of large buildings. In the end, these places where they took shelter would become their final resting places. Ash and pyroclastic flows ultimately buried the town under more than 20 feet of volcanic material, and in the process, a wealth of material was preserved for later generations to examine. The impact of the eruption on Herculaneum was no less. As you can see from this diagram, Herculaneum sits at probably one of the farthest edges on land of the impact of the Vesuvius. Its location in relation to the mountain and the predominant wind flows on the day of the eruption led to differences between how the eruption affected Pompeii and Herculaneum. While Pompeii is physically further from Vesuvius than Herculaneum was, due to the prevailing winds and the way the eruption occurred, Pompeii came in for an earlier hit from the volcano and also for a different type of material. This is evidenced in how you can see evidence of a more staged evacuation in Herculaneum. There are far fewer incidences of human remains left behind in Herculaneum than there are in Pompeii, suggesting that the residents of Herculaneum had more time to flee. Ultimately, some citizens were forced to shelter in place. The largest cache of victims that were found in Herculaneum was more than 300 individuals, which were discovered in the boat sheds along the waterfront of Herculaneum. The nature of the materials that covered Herculaneum, again, were perfect to preserve the remains that were there, but were of a different nature, degree, and in some cases even depth of material deposited. One recent find at Herculaneum, however, graphically demonstrates just how violent the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was. In examining the remains of a skeleton found at the Collegium Augustaleum, researchers found a hard, glassy substance coating the interior of the skull. Chemical analysis revealed proteins and fatty acids in the substance that are consistent with human brain tissue. As a result of their analysis, researchers were able to determine that the glassy substance was the vitrified remains of human brain tissue. In other words, the glassy obsidian-like chunks that you're looking at now are the remains of the melted soft tissue of the brain solidifying into glass upon cooling. The sudden overwhelming eruption of Mount Vesuvius sealed these towns away. They locked them in a time capsule and created a frozen day in the life. While some people got away, they did so with nothing more than the items they could carry as they ran. They didn't have a chance to pack up. They didn't have a chance to take all of their furniture or household goods. All they took was what they could throw together in an hour or two or three perhaps, and that was it. Everything else stayed, including all kinds of household objects, stored goods, and other things like food still cooking in the ovens and the contents of their latrines. This picture is from early excavations done at Pompeii during the turn of the century. This is one of my favorite pictures because it just gives you an idea of how long the excavations at Pompeii have been going on. This picture was taken just before the turn of the century, so it's very, very old. The sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum were largely left undisturbed for many centuries. While Herculaneum was originally discovered at the start of the 18th century, Pompeii was discovered in the 16th century. However, excavations on neither one of them began until the late 18th century. In Herculaneum, when it was discovered, the King of Naples supported excavations to undergo there. But largely, he directed his excavators to look for material resources. He was focused on the material culture that he could get from the ground. The work of artisans who had died thousands of years ago would go on to decorate the King of Naples' home and the homes of other rich patrons of the works. The excavations continued intermittently over the 18th and 19th century before being abandoned entirely. These would not resume until the early 20th century. And at that time, they would begin to be taken in a much more formal and scholarly manner than had previously been done. Pompeii's story is not much different. It too suffered the vagaries of excavators who were merely looking for works of art. This is one example. In an effort to get to a room to find if there was anything better on the other side, they simply chiseled a hole through the painted wall murals. You can also see areas of the wall where it's reduced to the underlying foundation. That's because they chiseled out mosaics so they could take them with them. The result was a very haphazard and disjointed process of discovery. A valuable loss of research was a direct consequence of the removal of remains. The picture you see here is one of the bone houses of Pompeii. When physical remains were found, they were carted up into baskets and carried off to a house that was designated as a bone house. In this process, as you can see here, bones became disarticulated and separated from the skeletons. In some cases, houses that were excavated were later reburied. Due to the smaller volcanic debris, the excavations did not suffer the same intermittent excavation process that Herculaneum did. So the difference between Herculaneum and Pompeii is that the material at Herculaneum was over 60 meters deep, and it was a much harder, denser material than the 20 meters of material that were found at Pompeii. Part of the reason that Pompeii began to be excavated earlier has a lot to do with the type of volcanic debris that buried Pompeii. Pompeii began to be excavated pretty consistently from its discovery and continued throughout the 19th century. It is during this time frame that the excavations became more formal and started to follow a plan, as the archaeologist in time, Giuseppe Fiorelli, put an end to the uncontrolled digging. It's also to Giuseppe that we owe our casted remains from Pompeii. While they paint a stark picture of what the residents of Pompeii went through as they died, they do further complicate our study of their diets, because in the process of casting the remains, it made it impossible to study the bones beneath. The current Reggio divisions of Pompeii and the preservations of body through casting are credited to Fiorelli and his formal planning. Despite this, it did undergo some of the same problems that Pompeii did with regards to excavations being paused due to overwhelming world events. Today, this is a picture of Pompeii from the digging season 2 years ago. As you can see, everything is being carried out in a much more formal manner. This brownish material off to the right-hand side is where they're currently doing the excavations, and they're doing an effort to preserve some of the more unstable buildings up here towards the middle foreground on the right. As you can see, they have the walls braced to preserve them. Today, excavations are being done not just to find out what we can learn about what's going on in the past, but to preserve what remains above ground. There's an unprecedented flow of information coming from the sites at Pompeii and Herculaneum that's shedding a new light on Roman life. Archaeologists at these sites are using new techniques and disciplines such as zooarchaeology, archaeobotany, and environmental archaeology to provide new information regarding the diet of ancient Romans based on samples of organic material and bones. These finds are not just coming from soil samples, but they are also coming from places like rubbish heaps, sewage systems, and latrines. This picture is of a latrine that was excavated in Herculaneum. The back part of the latrine closest to the wall, you can see the drainage tube that's going down to the sewer system. The front part would have had a wooden panel that slid in front of it. The panel was there for being able to remove it to clean, and also you can see there's a drainage tube down the front to help drain any materials that might collect towards the front of the latrine. The thing to know about latrines, especially in places like Herculaneum, is that they were not just for disposal of human detritus, but they were also for disposal of household detritus as well. Early diggers were seemingly more interested in scavenging the material culture, so they ignored things like the latrines or things that spoke to food and diet. While they did make note of finds that were related to the ancient diet, they only did it when significant quantities of particular food sources were found. One example is this. You see a note in Giuseppe Forelli's notes that says, a dolium of grain was found. And he doesn't say where it was located, how it was located, just that they found an entire dolium of grain. So they're recorded not within their context, which makes it harder to place them in the diet of the people. It wasn't until the modern era that researchers began to specifically include environmental sampling and archaeobotanical analysis in their plans of excavation. This more in-depth focus on the foodstuffs at Pompeii and Herculaneum led one researcher to compile a catalog. While this catalog is amazing in its intricacy, it again leaves out most of the context for where the finds were found. It begins to shed light on the food items found in the region, but without the context, it's only a jumping off point. It gives us no idea of who was consuming them. Continuing excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum give researchers access to additional information and contextual data that paints a richer, more detailed picture of the Roman diet than ever before. Perhaps the most significant of these finds comes from the Cardo 5 sewer in Herculaneum. This is the largest single deposit of food finds in the region that has ever been found to date. According to Andrew Wallace Hadrill, who is the director of the Herculaneum Conservation Project, more than 10 tons of material has been excavated from this location. This equates to some 775 15-liter containers of material. As of 2017, they were still processing the remains from the sewer because simply so much had been found. What is unique about this find is what it is able to tell us about the diet of people in different socioeconomic backgrounds. The Cardo 5 sewer is located under an entire urban block. The picture you're looking at now is a picture of the Insula Orientalis 2. This block comprised of shops on the ground floor and at least 3 floors of residential living spaces above it. Artifacts discovered in this complex seem to indicate that the shopkeepers lived on the ground floor in living spaces adjacent to their shops, while the upper level living spaces were occupied by wealthier, probably upper middle class citizens. All of the dwellings had latrines which drained into the Cardo 5 sewer. At first glance, it would be logical to assume that there would be an intermingling of the refuge from the different dwellings. However, the way in which the Cardo 5 sewer drains, this is a picture from the inside of the sewer. I've seen a picture of this in context with the Herculaneum conservator, Dr. Wallace Hadrill, and he is about 5'9". His head almost touches the top of the latrine. This is one of the access tunnels to go in and flush out the sewer system below the Insula Orientalis 2. All of the dwellings had latrines that drained into the Cardo 5. The way in which the Cardo 5 sewer drains led to a stratification of layers. If you could, I know the map's kind of small, I'm so sorry. I couldn't get it to blow up any larger so you could actually see it. But the little lines that are marked out along the length of the sewer indicate quadrants. And the way that the material drained into the Cardo 5 created both quadrants and stratification of layers that they were able to trace back to origin points within the actual Insula Orientalis 2. The stratification provides a way to differentiate the deposits and make some determination about which layers came from the lower class dwellings and which came from the more upper middle class dwellings. So what do the deposits reveal about the food that was being eaten by the residents of the Insula Orientalis 2? They found that the block, which housed both lower and middle class citizens, contained, as they expected, a diet rich in grains, fruits, nuts, and olive oil. But they also found that they ate a lot of fish. This picture that is before you now is, these are fish bones from various varieties of fish. So they found that there were over 72 different distinct varieties of fish that could be found in the small bones and shellfish examples of the sewer. They also found some 84 and 27 different mineralized and carbonized plant taxa, respectively. What's important about the difference between mineralized and carbonized plant taxa is the carbonized plant taxa tells us that food was being cooked inside the Insula Orientalis too. This is what you might expect to find if early historian assumptions about a largely vegetarian diet were to be believed. You'd expect to find a vast quantity of vegetative plant materials. However, they also found, as we've said, fish bones. Here is another example, and we're talking about some really tiny fish bones. The spine on the left-hand side of the screen is from a sea urchin. The 4mm fragments are actually ear bones from fish. The 2mm on the far right-hand side of the screen is more fish bones. And then there's a very, very small 2cm shellfish down here. And lots of shellfish. They found just in what they've excavated, what they've analyzed so far, 2,500 fish bones. They were able to identify approximately 72 species of fish, 48 marine shellfish species. This speaks to a wide variety of marine species being available for consumption. This mosaic was actually found in Pompeii. It gives you an idea of some of the species of fish that were available, because all of the fish, shellfish, and even the squid and octopus pictured here could be caught by fishermen in the Bay of Naples. They also found carbonized remains of figs, charred barley, and eggs. They found actually the remains of numerous eggshells. The majority of the shells came from chicken eggs, indicating a high consumption of this item, but they also discovered several fragments of goose eggshells. In addition to eggshells, they found small animal bones belonging to small fowl, peacock, sheep, pig, and chicken. They also found a variety of more rare food items, including sea urchins and dormice. For those of you who aren't familiar with Roman food, dormice are a type of plump rodents considered to be a delicacy to Romans. In one of the houses, they even found a dormice jar, which is a specially constructed jar with a maze-like interior that allows dormice to run up and down the insides of the jar. The dormice are raised in the jar and fed in the jar until they're plump enough to eat. They also found a variety of exotic food items, including dates and spices such as peppercorns and mint seeds. If the assumptions of the early historians are accurate, there should be a clear disparity in the strata of the lower class residents versus the strata for the upper middle class residents. The historical perspective would suggest low food diversity for the less wealthy residents and an absence of expensive food items. Instead, the evidence exhibits a great deal of similarity of foodstuffs from one strata to the other. In fact, many of the same food items, even expensive items such as black pepper, appear in the strata of both the lower and upper middle class residents. This suggests that those who resided in the Insula Orientalis too ate largely the same diet regardless of their socioeconomic standing. The only exception to this being evidenced by the slightly rarer food items like goose eggs appearing in the refuse of the wealthier residents. And while the spices appear in both strata, you do see more spices in the wealthier strata than you do in the lower stratas. How does this compare with findings at Pompeii? Although there is no equivalent of a Carto 5 in Pompeii, thanks to the works of researchers both with the University of Cincinnati's Porta Stabia Archaeological Research Project and the Pompeii Pistrina Project, there is a significant variety of archaeobotanical finds. The excavations have uncovered at least 10 cesspits in the neighborhood of the Porta Stabia. While it is by no means as large as the Carto 5 discovery, researchers were able to remove several cubic meters of material for analysis. The properties in the Portastabia, like those in the Insula Orientalis too, show that there were socioeconomic distinctions between the residents living in Pompeii. What these finds have demonstrated is that Pompeii had a larger variety of foodstuffs than Herculaneum, as supported by the discovery of a butchered giraffe leg. And I'm sorry, I tried to find a picture of the giraffe leg, but none of the books that I have actually had a picture of the leg in it. I'm given to understand that it's very interesting because you can see evidence of butchering on the bone itself. For the most part, however, the finds in Pompeii greatly resemble the finds of Herculaneum and show to a great extent the same level of diversity. Here, there is also a suggestion that the wealthier residents had more access to slightly more rare food items, again, like dormice and giraffe, but to a large extent ate the same foodstuffs across socioeconomic strata. Among some of the imported spices that were found in both stratas in the Portastabia project were black pepper and caraway. This would seem to suggest that the two cities were much alike in their diet, and that the diet available to the residents of both was nutritionally more diverse than the subsistence diet that they were previously thought to be consumed. But actual food remains aren't the only evidence that we have of diet. Skeletal remains are another way in which we can examine the diet and health in the people of Pompeii. By scrutinizing specific characteristics of bones, determinations can be made regarding the general health of the population. Bones contain the history of growth, of trauma, and of disease. And by examining the carbon and nitrogen isotopes contained within the bones and trace minerals within the bones, clues to the diets of individuals can be obtained through their remains. Unfortunately, as we previously mentioned, Pompeii's data set reveals complications. Pictured here is Dr. Estelle Laser. She is one of the preeminent scientists in this field who is studying the bones of both Pompeii and Herculaneum to look at disease progression as well as health and diet. The initial excavations did much to compromise the data in Pompeii because there were inconsistencies in the recording of not only where remains were found, what was found with remains, but also because, as you can see in this picture, the bones were removed to bone houses for storage purposes. This caused the skeletal remains to become disarticulated in the storage process. This separation of the skeletons makes it difficult to later reassemble full individuals. The loss of the full skeletons makes it hard to identify some of the characteristics that are necessary for studying skeletons in bone pathology purposes. One example of the problem of skeletons being disarticulated through the storage process comes to us from an article that was just published at the beginning of this year. For many years, the Museum of Naples believed that they had the full skeleton of Pliny the Elder based on documents documenting its storage process and transferring it down. However, DNA analysis was recently conducted on the skull that has long been thought to belong to Pliny the Elder. After analysis, the researchers cannot conclusively say that it is in fact Pliny's skull, though it does contain many markers that would be consistent with Pliny's characteristics. What they can say with absolute certainty is that the jawbone that was found with the skeleton belongs to a completely different person. By contrast, the Herculaneum data is much more cohesive. Most of the skeletal remains in Herculaneum were discovered in the later part of the 20th and the early parts of the 21st century. And when they were discovered, they were excavated and archived in a much more careful and deliberate fashion. Here you see an assemblage of bones from the Herculaneum excavations. The bones pictured here all belong to a single individual. They're laid out on the table for study purposes. What you can't see because of the blurry background is there's actually a box behind the bones that when they're not being studied, the bones are carefully repacked within the box and stored all together. Because the excavations at Herculaneum were carried out in a more deliberate fashion, the remains are cataloged and preserved with an eye to a more complete analysis. Several types of analysis have been conducted with regard to the skeletal remains. One of the analyses that was taken place, you can see being done in this picture here. The two researchers pictured here are measuring bones and diagramming all of the intricacies of the different marks, as well as size and length indications of wear on the bones. They're conducting a bone pathology study. With the Pompeii dataset, analysis largely focused on the individual bones that are most likely to yield the most information. These include the long bones, pelvic bones, and skulls, including teeth. Unsurprisingly, the teeth indicate that there was a lack of oral hygiene in comparison to what we would consider modern Western society standards. This apparent lack of hygiene could provide some indicators as to underlying health issues such as systemic infection or other soft tissue pathology. On the other hand, there is a frequency of healed injuries that reflects a certain robusticity in the immune system of the population. This is further evidenced by osteophytic changes in the bones. These osteophytic changes are things that we would expect to see in older adult populations. They represent the presence of conditions like arthritis that are more consistent with the bones of those people who have survived to later adulthood. Despite the difficulties of the Pompeii dataset, it is still possible to compare it with analyses of that of the Herculaneum dataset. The remains of more than 300 intact skeletons have been discovered at Herculaneum so far, while excavations still remain ongoing. The Herculaneum bones have been subjected to the same kinds of pathological studies that have occurred at Pompeii. Based on the goods and apparels found with the Herculaneum remains, we can also make some assumptions about the people that were buried there. And these assumptions have a lot to do with their different socioeconomic classes. Based on the remains found around the bones, it would appear that the 300 individuals found in the boat sheds at Herculaneum represent a cross-section of Herculaneum society. In addition, the pathology of the bones shows that some bones had much more wear and tear on the bones that would be consistent with hard labor. And this matches up to the grave goods that are found with them. The studies at Herculaneum indicate that the population of Herculaneum, while prone to some diseases, especially in childhood, were largely a healthy population, regardless of socioeconomic standing. These findings are very similar to the findings of the Pompeii studies. This would appear to corroborate the findings of the Pompeii studies, and it suggests that despite the randomness of the sample of the remains due to the separation of skeletons, that the citizens of Pompeii were also a largely healthy population. Again, at this point, this is a lot of conjecture from scientists, because again, the Pompeii data set is so confused because of the bones becoming separated. Pathological examinations, though, are not without their limitation. Any examination of the physical changes of the bones themselves cannot necessarily reveal the diseases that affect the soft tissues, nor the nutritional consumption. The only thing that they can give us is some idea of the degree of overall health. Fortunately, there is a way to examine the bones at a more elemental level. In addition to the pathological analysis, researchers in Pompeii have been able to conduct stable carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis of the skeletons. This type of analysis can reveal so much about the diets of an ancient people because there's a direct relationship between the types of foods being consumed and the isotope signature of the element found in the bones. So what new knowledge do these studies impart? The isotope analysis reveals that the people of Pompeii ate a diet rich in diversity. The food that they ate consisted of a range of fruits, vegetables, grains, seafood, and meat of domesticated wild animals. This data corroborates the archaeological finds of both the Caro 5 and the Portostatia. Additionally, it supplements that data by giving us some quantitative estimates for various food categories. Estimates from the nitrogen levels would suggest that marine proteins comprised, on average, between 1/4 and 1/3 of the diet. There was some fluctuation in the nitrogen levels based on gender. The studies are showing us that the female diet and the male diet are slightly different. Carbon levels also indicate that the remainder of the diet was comprised of plants and herbivores. Unfortunately, carbon testing is unable at this time to distinguish between whether the food eaten is just plants or is derived from plant-eating animals. And back to the gender thing, I forgot one thing. The gender differences between nitrogen and carbon levels in the male and female gender bones indicate that males consume slightly higher amounts of protein than females. Unfortunately, stable carbon and nitrogen analysis has not yet been completed for the skeletal remains of Herculaneum, although those processes are ongoing. However, they have undergone a trace mineral analysis in order to detect other indicators of diet. This analysis examined the remains for traces of zinc, copper, and strontium. The results of this found that the remains contained high levels of strontium and zinc. The levels of these minerals indicate that the residents across economic categories ate a diet high in marine fish, crustaceans, and legumes, but low in red meat. This would seem to be a corroboration of the nitrogen and carbon isotope analysis from the Pompeii, but until we get a full nitrogen and carbon isotope analysis from Herculaneum, it's easy to see links, but it's not able to fully connect the dots. So, looking at all these archaeological finds, the stable isotope analysis, the trace mineral analysis, the question begs to be asked: what does it truly reveal about the previous knowledge of the Roman diet? Well, while antiquity provided answers to some extent through poems and other writings, it doesn't give an accurate description. The overwhelming evidence indicates that the Roman population, including the lower classes, was much healthier and had greater access to wide varieties of foods than originally thought. What all this evidence is really indicating is that the Roman population, including the lower classes, is healthier than we would previously thought. And the remains and the stable carbon nitrogen isotope analysis and the trace mineral analysis seems to indicate that they had access to and were eating a greater variety of foods than we had previously thought. Additional revelations indicate that diet wasn't necessarily based on class. A recent discovery in the Aplantis suburb of Pompeii has located another 50 intact skeletal remains. While full analysis of the remains is still underway, preliminary forensic investigations indicate that while most people ate meat and fish, at least one of the skeletons, believed to be a female in her early 20s, led a largely vegetarian diet. This find is particularly noteworthy because at this early stage, due to assumptions that are made based on her socioeconomic class. She was found with high-class grave goods. There's no indication on her bones of hard labor. So the indication is that we have someone of the higher, more wealthy class who's making a decision about diet, not based on what her financial situation allows her, but what she either chooses to eat for medical, personal, or even perhaps religious reasons. This would suggest that vegetarian diets were not entirely related to poverty, but may instead reflect the availability of choices in the Roman diet. What is also clear is what food was available was not dictated solely by what was grown in the region. Modern archaeological investigations into the agricultural regions of Pompeii and Herculaneum indicate that there was at least some reliance on outside food sources for certain commodities, such as much as the fertile ground was given over to more profitable export crops like grain and grapes for wine and olives for oil. It is evident from the environment and fertility of the ground that cereals could be grown in the region, but of the local cereals, not enough were produced to feed the population. It is also apparent from records that are kept at the nearby Sulpici archive that the region definitely relied on imports of pulses and grains from Egypt. It's also apparent that the appearance of dates, peppercorns, and other non-local spices, that there was a thriving trade in foodstuffs imported from other parts of the empire and beyond. The work being done at Pompeii and Herculaneum begins to paint a picture of the Roman diet that we haven't had before. It can be said that at least for the citizens of these two cities, their diet was more diverse and nutritional than originally believed. It's not the subsistence diet argued by Johnston or the extravagant banquets suggested by Apicius, but rather it's something in between. It's tempting, so tempting to make assumptions about the entire Roman Empire based on just these two cities. But that's a question that's outside the data set that we have. More examination is necessary before it can definitively be argued that the dietary diversity of Pompeii and Herculaneum applies to the whole Roman world. More research is definitely needed. There are ongoing excavations at the port city of Ostia that will add still more to the ever-changing understanding of the Central Empire. And of course, similar questions must be asked about the provinces in Asia Minor and North Africa. Interestingly, archaeobotanical research is currently being done in both the Netherlands and Britain. And the archaeobotanical research that's happening is beginning to show that in both cases, Roman rule coincided with a much better and more varied diet than either of those regions had, either before or after the advent of Roman influence in the region. This, combined with the data from Herculaneum and Pompeii, gives us reason to hope that other places within the Roman Empire may have had much healthier and more varied diets than historically thought, because these outlying provinces are also showing evidence of more healthy and varied diets. While it's way too soon to make generalizations about the data, about the diets of the whole of the Roman world, this new knowledge is leading us to the tantalizing possibility that the diet of the Roman world was richer and more diverse than it ever was imagined. So how does that apply to us as SCA cooks? If you're looking at it strictly from the prospect of preparing a feast, most of us are going to rely on recipes from Apicius or Cato or Columella or Pliny if we're making an extravagant high-end feast. But what it does tell us as reenactors is that if we're trying to recreate a diet of a more middle or lower class family, we have more options than we previously had before. This is very exciting research to me, and I'm still looking into the digs that are going on in Ostia and in the Netherlands and Britain, because I want to expand my understanding of the empire. It's clear from what we've seen so far that trade played a key and important part in the diet of the Roman Empire, but also in the diet not just of the Central Roman Empire, but of the provinces as well. Did anybody have questions? Sorry, I talked a lot.
No, you did a great job, Jenna. There has been a couple of things that came by in the chat, but most of it was all thank yous and commentary on what you said.
Yes, mostly thank yous, but if people do have questions, please feel free to unmute.
Yeah, I'd love to answer your questions. I'm gonna turn off the share for now. So I wrote a research paper that this class is based on. I'm happy to provide that for anyone who wants it. I think that's what I'm going to send as my handout. But also it's posted on my website, so you are welcome to check out my website, and I'll be happy to provide that information there. There's also, on my website, you will find redactions of recipes. There's one entire cookbook of Roman recipes that I've done on there as well. Yeah, let me grab that URL for you real quick.
Oh, I have one question, but that's because I've read your paper.
Go for it.
So you're talking about expanding into into Britain and into other locations where the Romans went. There is some new archaeological and carbon and nitrogen data that is in that. Are you going to be looking mostly on that, or are you looking also on the ones based on plant material that is found as well, or a combination of both?
A combination of both. I don't think you can get a full picture of the diet looking at just one aspect of it. I think we need the archaeobotanical data. We need the stable carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis. We need the bone pathology. All of these are pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and we have some of the pieces, but we need all of them in order to get a full picture.
I think there's a question in chat. Is there more information on herbs and spices that were found, both edible and medicinal? I'll give you my contact information. That is my research is in spices. So
that's what I was going to suggest. Arwen she is one of the experts when it comes to spices. The problem with the remains that we have from the data sets in Pompeii and Herculaneum regarding herbs and spices. Herbs that are completely consumed in the cooking process, it's hard to differentiate. We are making assumptions based on herbs and spices based on seeds that we found. Peppercorns, mint seeds, fennel seeds, caraway seeds. Things that were consumed in the cooking process, it's harder for us. Although we do have records of some of the more exotic things being exported or imported in from export cities. One of the really notable things that you'll find if you get really interested in Roman food archaeology is the difference between laser and Parthian laser, which, while similar flavors, come from two different plants. And also in the recipe books, you'll see that for a long time it's just laser, 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 and then all of a sudden Apicius starts calling it Parthian laser. One of the reasons for that is the plant that made laser, the original plant, went extinct in the 1st century. And one of the things that historians and food archaeologists are theorizing is that the laser went extinct because the Romans ate it all. Because it was very popular. Parthian laser comes from a different, though similar, plant in the same family. And it was considered a lower class version of the same taste combination. But as laser became extinct, then they started using Parthian laser instead.
Interesting.
I apologize for the meowing in the background. My cat is very unhappy that I won't be in the office while I'm working.
Uh-oh.
Loud cat. He wants loud.
Anybody have any questions?
Think too?
I'm sorry?
Sorry. Is Parthian laser still also believed to be extinct?
No, Parthian laser is what we would know as asafoetida.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a jar of it, both in the resin and the ground format in my spice cabinet at the moment. Although I do recommend, if you're using asafoetida, get the resin and grind it yourself, because it loses some of its flavor and its efficacy after grinding. So I typically only grind it as I need it. Yes, the Parthians would object to that characterization. I agree with you. She said that the Parthians would object to the laser being their Parthian laser being classified as lower class, but we all know Romans had class issues. Anybody else have any questions?
No, just thank yous because you're awesome and the class was great.
Well, thank you.
And I think
I had a question.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Gwennon, here in Callantyre. I
Okay.
wanted to ask if there were any indications of what the slaves would eat. Do you know about that, or?
So the 300 bodies that were found in situ in Herculaneum included everything from upper wealthy class individuals all the way down to several slaves. They, the bone pathology and the trace mineral analysis that have been done on those bones so far indicate that they were largely very healthy. We know that they were, we assume, I shouldn't say we know, we assume that they were slaves based on the hardware work, marks on their bones, as well as the very simple grave goods that were found with them.
Okay. Okay. I just didn't know if the diet of a slave would be, because of their status, would be very plain compared to the diet of a wealthy Roman aristocrat.
So the answer to that is actually complicated because there was a class system
Yeah.
of slaves as well. We know from graffiti in a public lavatory that a slave was the physician to one of the emperors. Slaves could own stuff. They could have wealth. They could have a high-class position in society.
Wow.
So you could have a very wealthy, high-class physician slave. You could also have your general laborer slave. So we're going to see stratifications not just between Roman citizens, but also Roman slaves based on what resources. There are some estimates that up to 60% of the population of Pompeii may have been 60% of the free population of Pompeii may have formerly been slaves.
Wow.
So the ability to move out of slavery would also seem to be higher than we previously thought, because we didn't have records. In a lot of cases, the written records get destroyed, but in Pompeii and Herculaneum, a lot of written records were preserved. Some of them are highly carbonized, and they are using special scanning technologies to scan the scrolls and remove the carbon backprint so that they can actually see the writings. In some places, we have clay tablets. Clay tablets are great. They survived way better than the papyri did, but they're working with high resonance scanners and imagers to try and even decipher the highly carbonized papyri scrolls.
Fascinating. Just fascinating.
And if you come up with a question later, you are welcome to email me. I will drop my email in chat as well.
Yes.
To answer questions. There's also a comment feature on my website. So if you lose my email, you can comment and it'll send me an email to respond to you at.
Okay.
Thank you guys so much for coming. I really hope you enjoyed the class. And
thank you, Fina, for teaching. This has been the first time that we've done an online colloquium like this. It's the first time we've ever had a pandemic that has kept us all snugly at home. So thank you so much, and thank everyone for attending. This has been really great. Really appreciate everybody who's participating, either teaching or attending, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes.
thank you. Again, feel free to reach out to me off the chat. I'm happy to answer questions or provide copies of my research for anybody who wants it.
And could you also provide your website, your Wexbyte website or whatever that was?
Yeah,
that would be helpful too.
One more time.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.